Chapter 103, The Market 3. Where did he go? Ujicha, chief warrior of the Garung tribe, couldn't help but feel flustered. He had lost sight of the slave trader. Could the man have escaped? But would he really have run away, leaving behind the elves that he had paid so much money to purchase and even his own wife? More importantly, if the merchant really had run away, just when had he found an opening to do so? Ujicha had been looking right at him, never once turning his gaze away. In fact, he had blinked a few times. As he was only human, Ujicha definitely couldn't go without blinking. It was precisely during that blink of an eye. That span of time was long enough for Eugene to accelerate away from his position. Bam! A kick from outside his field of vision slammed into Ujicha's jaw. This blow completely surpassed all of Ujicha's expectations. Who could have imagined that a lowly slave trader would be able to move like that? As a result, Ujicha didn't even manage to let out a cry. The surprise attack was too quick and sharp. With just one blow, Ujicha had lost consciousness. His pupils widened sightlessly as the over 2 meters tall giant staggered on his feet. Splat! Collapsing backward, Ujicha's bald head fell right in the center of a puddle of vomit. Dajarang, who was still gagging as he found himself unable to shake off the motion sickness, couldn't help but let out a scream. WW! Without even wiping away the vomit that was staining his mouth, Dajarang jumped backward. At least he tried to jump backward. As someone who had been overweight for most of his life, his overworked knees were unable to execute the sudden leap command. In the end, Dajarang wasn't able to back off as far as he had intended. After only having taken a couple of steps, the churning that this movement set off within his bloated body once again set off his urge to vomit. Uarg! Dajarang vomited all over the unconscious Ujicha's face. Eugene had seen all sorts of messy and terrible things during his previous life, but his face still distorted in an honest look of disgust at the sight in front of him. Fuck, that's nasty, Eugene cursed. Dajarang just kept vomiting. Uarg. Just how much did you eat that you can keep vomiting and vomiting without any sign of stopping? Eugene spat out as he wriggled his fingers. Strands of wind condensed around his fingertips and shot towards Dajarang. Boom! A bullet of wind struck Dajarang right in the solar plexus and stuck there without scattering. As someone who had contracted Tempest, the spirit king of the wind, Eugene could control this breeze as easily as if it was the mana within his own core. Uarg. The ball of wind embedded into the pit of Dajarang's stomach began to swirl. As it drilled into Dajarang's fat belly, it sent vibrations throughout the rest of his body. It wasn't just Dajarang's flesh that was sent rippling. The violent ball of wind shook Dajarang's innards, forcing everything that still remained in his stomach and had yet to be vomited up and out of his esophagus. For someone like Dajarang, who had been born to account and lived a life without any suffering or hardship, the pain that he was presently feeling was an unknown sensation that he had never before experienced in his life and hoped never to experience again in the future. After Dajarang had vomited out everything that had been in his stomach, he was left crawling on the floor, tears and snot dripping down his face. Dajarang begged, "Please spare me." "Who said that I was going to kill you?" Eugene spat out as he wrinkled his nose. He had been worried that Dajarang would just keep vomiting without being able to answer his questions, so Eugene's assault had just been meant to make sure that there was nothing left to vomit. Instead of getting any closer to Dajarang, Eugene just pointed a finger at him. Although Eugene had only pointed a finger at him, Dajarang let out a squeal and got onto his knees. Dajarang would never forget the pain that he had just felt when those outstretched fingers had launched the ball of wind that had assaulted him. As such, Dajarang couldn't help but preemptively get on his knees in a begging position. In all his 23 years of life, this was the first time that this young master had lacked confidence that his authority as the son of a count would be enough to protect him from the threat right in front of him. "How much money do you have on you?" Eugene bluntly asked. Pinching his outstretched index finger and his thumb together, Eugene formed a circle with his hand. It was obvious what that gesture symbolized, but this greedy demand actually reassured Dajarang. If all that Eugene wanted was money, wasn't that simple and easy to handle? I have about 300 million sals in actual currency. In jewels I have about 1 billion sals, Dajarang honestly confessed. "And what would you do if I asked you for that money?" Eugene prompted. Dajarang stammered, "Oh, of course I'll give it to you. I'm grateful that you're willing to give it to me." But maybe you'll remember this incident later and try to get revenge on me? Eugene purposefully emphasized the word later as he stared at Dodgerang. These words caused Dodgerang to make the best use of his head in all his 23 years of life. He immediately reached a conclusion. Since the word later had been uttered, wouldn't it mean that the merchant didn't intend to kill him? Dodgerang immediately shook his head. Oh, on Count Kobol's honor, something like that definitely won't happen, Dodgerang swore. Why are you placing your innocent father's honor on the line? Eugene grumbled as he stared at Dodgerang. I never did anything to provoke you. If I really had to come up with something, it would be that I didn't sell you the slave that you wanted. But as a merchant, it's up to me to decide whether or not I sell you something, isn't that right? Why yes, Dodgerang quickly agreed. Then things should have been over once we parted ways, but then you had to try and kill me. Isn't that right? You definitely colluded with that native who's lying over there, the one who's still out cold. You were planning on killing me and also planning on killing the woman who's with me, then you would just steal away the elves that I've been transporting for yourself. Am I right? Eugene eyed him challengingly. Yes, Dodgerang reluctantly admitted. All the while, Dodgerang was inwardly praying to himself, don't wake up. Ejicha was still lying there unconscious. But what would happen if he woke up? Would Ejicha be able to do anything to change this situation? The chief warrior of the Garang tribe, someone who had been knocked unconscious by a single blow from this slave trader, and who had begged for his life while pissing himself in front of the monster that had killed Braun. Trembling in fear, Dodgerang slowly reached into his pocket. Eugene nodded in approval. Since you're the one who caused all of this to happen in the first place, you should also be the one to take responsibility for this. The item that Dodgerang pulled out of his pocket was a small purse. Darang turned the purse upside down and shook it. Several large jewelry boxes fell out with a thud. This is the price that you've paid to keep your life, Eugene warned him as he stared at Dodgerang with narrowed eyes. If you try to find me again, then you won't be able to pay me off with just jewels. I truly will take your life as the cost of your sins. Eugene's face had been disguised. The identity that he had used to enter Samar was also a fake one. And in the first place, ever since he had truly entered the forest, he had never actually used his identity card. As for the currency and the jewels that he was currently taking from Dodgerang, things like these could be laundered cleanly no matter the amount. Even so, Eugene had still given Dodgerang a warning. Then he summoned up a breeze that carried the heavy jewelry boxes over to him. Arg, just then Ejicha opened his eyes with a groan. The first thing that he sensed was an indescribably complex and subtle flavor. Behind that lingered a somewhat familiar smell. These two things quickly awakened his dazed mind. Gag! Ejicha shouted as he shot upright. While scraping off the vomit that covered his head and face, Ejicha quickly took in his surroundings. He saw Dodgerang on his knees and the jewelry boxes floating in the air. And in front of him stood the slave trader. Rage drove Ejicha's body into immediate action. He let out a roar and charged at Eugene. Ejicha wasn't someone who had won the position of the chief warrior solely on the basis of his fearsome looks. His mana, which had quickly sprung into operation, accelerated Ejicha's body into a blur. However, this level of acceleration still seemed slow to Eugene. He clicked his tongue and gently pressed his foot into the ground. Baba-bang! The ground in front of him rose to become a barrier. Magic! Ejicha realized in alarm as kicked off the ground into a jump. As he did, he felt that something was off. The warriors of Samar were all able to receive the protection of the spirits without having to learn summoning magic. The warriors who were born in this vast forest possessed an affinity to spirits from birth, and in Ejicha's case he had received the protection of the spirits of the wind. The primal spirits existing in every gust of wind were what allowed Ejicha to move so agilely for his size. However, his current leap forward wasn't as powerful as he'd been expecting. Ejicha had intended on leaping high into the sky and crushing this cheeky slave trader's skull by smashing down on him from above. But his current leap only barely allowed him to jump over the barrier. What's going on? Ejicha asked himself. The reason was quite simple. Primitive spirits without their own will couldn't resist the command of higher spirits, and all the wind in the area was under Eugene's control. In other words, Ejicha's compatibility with Eugene was the absolute worst. Eugene waved his right hand towards Ejicha. A huge gust of wind swallowed Ejicha. The gust then transformed into a storm of blades, tearing Ejicha's clothes into pieces. Gaff! Ujicha screamed as he struggled in the middle of this slicing whirlwind. Eugene stared at Ujicha with an indifferent expression on his face. Unlike his hairless scalp, Ujicha's body was covered in thick hair. Eugene nodded to himself and clenched his hand into a fist. Bang! The gust of wind exploded. With his body engulfed by the wind, Ujicha had all of his hair torn out at the root by the explosion, leaving not a single strand behind. Kaya! Ujicha let out a high-pitched scream as he experienced a pain the likes of which he had never felt before in his life. The smooth-shaven Ujicha fell to the ground, but he didn't manage to land on his feet. Eugene raised another gust of wind that lifted Ujicha back into the air. Let go of me, Ujicha demanded as he tried to somehow wrestle himself free of the wind's grasp. Ujicha's core churned as he squeezed all he could out of his mana and earnestly prayed to the spirits that had granted him their protection. In addition to that, he even activated the battle sorcery of the Garung tribe. The Garung tribe's battle sorcery borrowed the power of the soul. Could be seen as a kind of necromancy. It wasn't just the Garung. There were several tribes that used this type of battle sorcery that was derived from necromancy, and the techniques that Ujicha used weren't anything uncommon to Samar. But it was something that in Eugene's opinion shouldn't be used. Eugene felt the souls that were being drawn to Ujicha. It was similar to how black magic could summon resentful spirits and completely erase the selves from their past lives. How disgusting, Eugene thought with a scowl. Eugene hated this type of sorcery because of how much it resembled black magic. As such, he didn't feel the need to show any mercy. After all, his opponent wasn't someone who deserved mercy in this first place. This bastard was the one who had tried to attack him unprovoked. Yua. Dajarang covered his ears, his body trembling as he tried to block out the screams that were coming from above his head. There was also crackling and popping as Ujicha's bones were forcibly twisted. Ujicha quickly started screaming for mercy, causing Dajarang to recall a memory from just a few days ago that he had earnestly hoped never to recall. It was the memory of the monster that had torn Braun into two pieces with such ease. Their bestial eyes that had flashed gold from beneath their hood, and the sharp fangs that appeared each time the monster's lips curled up into a smile. I just want to go back, Dajarang desperately prayed. Back to my home, to Shimuan. The sound of Ujicha's screams began to fade away. It wasn't because the screams had stopped. Instead, the source of the screams was quickly flying away from Dajarang. Would a human be able to survive having their limbs twisted like a pretzel and then being thrown into the distance? Even if fate somehow allowed them to survive, how would they be able to continue living in this savage forest with a body that couldn't move on its own? But none of that mattered to Eugene. He packed the jewelry boxes inside of his cloak, then he returned to the cart. May you have a peaceful death, Christina prayed in the direction that Ujicha had flown with her hands clasped in front of her. These words felt like a nasty joke to Eugene. He sneered and said, "It's ridiculous to expect a peaceful death for him. If he somehow manages to survive, he's in for a fate worse than death. And even if he gets lucky and dies as soon as he hits the ground, he'll still have to suffer all that pain before he dies. However, after his death he may find peace," Christina responded with a soft smile. Yep, she was just as twisted as expected. As he hid such a thought, Eugene grabbed hold of the reins. With a rattle, the cart began to move. The elves were completely silent, not even daring to breathe. However, even as they did their best to not attract attention, they were glancing over at Dajarang, who was still kneeling on the ground. The elves, who had become accustomed to being persecuted while being sold as slaves, felt an unfamiliar pleasure when they saw this human noble kneeling on the ground and pleading for his life, still not daring to raise his head. The same went for Lavera. She touched the scarred pit that had once been her right eye before it was stabbed out with a sword by her former master and then cauterized. An unfamiliar heat was burning in her eye socket. Heat of a completely different kind from the pain that she had felt when she was burned. How cool, Lavera thought to herself as she stared at Eugene's back with a passionate eye. I think that you should probably head west, Signard said vaguely. Your words don't sound very certain, Eugene critiqued. It can't be helped. I told you that I haven't been able to properly retain the memories, Signard grumbled with a frown. All that's left of my memories are a few fragmented recollections. Solely relying on those, I wandered around desperately searching for our domain. If that's the case, then why don't we just go looking for it together? Eugene offered, his head tilted to the side in question. Signard didn't answer right away. After staring at Eugene for a few moments, he grinned and shook his head. Of course I can't do that. Because I don't know what might happen while I'm away from the village, Sigurd explained. Although it was the first time that Eugene had made this offer, he had already expected that Sigurd would reply in such a manner. The fairy tree's barrier wasn't absolute. The reason why this village built for the wandering elves had lasted for all these years was because Sigurd cut down all the intruders who attempted to approach it. In the recent years, I've been coming in more frequent contact with the dark elves, Sigurd muttered as he stroked the sword at his side. Every time they draw near, I catch, interrogate and execute them. By doing so, I've been able to keep abreast of the situation. I've heard that the corruptor Iris has been trying to infect more of the elves with her corruption in order to secure her position. Eugene listened silently. Isn't it funny? That girl is a monster. No, she's a piece of shit that shouldn't even exist. So much so that it's even hard to believe that we were once the same race, much less belonging to the same nation. After being responsible for massacring so many elves 300 years ago, does she really think she can just take the remaining elves into her embrace at this point? Prick. Sigurd gripped the hilt of his sword tightly as he ground his teeth. I can't trust her word. Iris and her dark elves say that they are only making the wandering elves an offer, but there is no way that's the truth. They must be intimidating those poor elves and forcibly turning them into dark elves. If the elves refuse to accept the offer, then they would surely be killed. What would happen if the dark elves were to come, while I was absent from the village? Sigurd had taken part in the war 300 years ago. He was one of the few survivors left among the elven rangers. In a forest that had been set on fire by Iris, he had seen hundreds of corpses belonging to elves who had had their intestines pulled out. This scene had burned itself into Sigurd's brain, becoming an unshakable memory that had haunted him for the past hundreds of years. If we do manage to find the elven territory, then it might help you to overcome your trauma, Eugene said with a bitter smile. After all, since no one had been able to find it for hundreds of years, it should still be at peace. Yes, that's right, Sigurd muttered as he loosened his tight grip on the hilt of his sword. If we aren't able to find it, then don't feel too disappointed, Eugene continued. It might not be as large as Samar, but the forest at our main estate is also pretty large. It wouldn't make a noticeable difference even if 100 or so elves started living within it. More than that, it should be much safer, Sigurd sighed as he looked at Eugene with a relieved expression. Thank you, Hamel. Eugene tried to brush him off. What are you saying all of a sudden? Because if you hadn't come here, I wouldn't have had any hope of safely bringing the elves to leave this village. As such, I must express my gratitude, Sigurd explained sincerely. Well, what else can I say? Eugene accepted this thanks with a snort and stood up. So anyway, I should just go west from here. Is there anything else? Since hundreds of years have passed, all of the landmarks should also have changed, Sigurd admitted with a shrug. Useless bastard, Eugene scoffed. While heading west, pay close attention to the leaf. If you do that, then you should probably be able to find your way into the territory. Sigurd lowered his gaze and let out a sigh. I'm afraid that I have no other advice for you. Then that's all I need to know. I'll set off immediately. Eugene patted Sigurd on the shoulder and left the hut. Christina was already waiting for him at the entrance to the village. After offering a bow to Sigurd, who had followed behind Eugene, she turned to Eugene and asked, Are we heading out now? Yep, Eugene confirmed with a nod. Christina wasn't the only one waiting for them at the entrance. All of the elves who lived in this village had come out to see them off. It seemed that there were believers who worshipped the god of light among them, as some of the elves put their hands together and raised a prayer to Christina. Though it wasn't just Christina. Several elves were also looking at Eugene with expectant eyes. Such gazes weren't unfamiliar to him. It's heavy, Eugene thought to himself. Whether it was in the past or the present, such gazes that were full of expectation felt unbearably heavy. But did the elves have any option other than praying earnestly for Eugene and Christina's success? They had to know that his village wasn't guaranteed to stay safe. So they couldn't help but hang their expectations onto Eugene and Christina. As he looked around, Eugene recalled something. Vermouth? Nerissa was sobbing and crying as she said goodbye. Though they'd only been traveling together for a few days, she seemed to have developed a crush on him. Even as she cried, she was looking at Eugene with admiration in her tearful eyes. Lavella was also looking at him with eyes similar to Nerissa's. Finishing the thought, Eugene asked his old friend, "Did all this feel even heavier for you than it does for me? Everyone calling him a hero and having to bear everyone's expectations. No matter where he went, those who recognized Vermouth would always ask him to save the world, defeat the demon kings, and avenge the deaths of their children, parents, and friends. I would hate to be a hero." Eugene unconsciously spat out his true feelings. Huh. Christina turned to Eugene with a puzzled expression. "That's just the way I feel," Eugene muttered with a shrug. Chapter 104, Sienna 1. It was a few days after they had headed west, following Signard's directions. After leaving the village of the Wandering Elves, they hadn't run into anything particularly troublesome. They had encountered a few monsters and discovered traces of nearby tribes, but they hadn't run into any of the natives. Ah, Eugene let out a gasp. He felt movement coming from the leaf of the world tree that he had stored in his chest pocket. It wasn't just an illusion. Most of Eugene's senses had been focused on this dried leaf during these past few days of travel, and Eugene wasn't foolish enough to make such a mistake no matter how eagerly he had been waiting for a response. Eugene immediately pulled the leaf out of his pocket. He stilled the wind that was blowing towards them and then stared at the leaf as he held it in the palm of his hand. The leaf began to move once more. Having come over to his side at some point, Christina's face brightened as she saw this. The leaf in Eugene's palm moved slowly. While constantly shifting ever so slightly, the leaf was moving forward in a certain direction. "It's like a compass," Eugene muttered as he placed it back inside his pocket. "Why are you putting it back?" Christina asked. "It's cumbersome to keep holding it in my hand as we travel. In any case, even if I keep it in my pocket, I can still feel where it's trying to head," Eugene explained. This direction was just slightly off from due west. It looked like Signard's memory wasn't wrong, so for him to have failed to find the elven territory even with that, there had to be another reason that had kept him from doing so. While feeling his heart pound with excitement, Eugene hurried his steps. As they went in the direction that it was indicating, the leaf's reaction grew stronger. At first it would only wriggle slightly to show they were going in the right direction, but now it was practically oscillating as if it was trying to climb out of his pocket. As the leaf's reaction grew stronger, Eugene's steps also grew faster. Without losing track of Eugene's movements, Christina kept following him. "Sir Eugene," Christina called out. "I know," Eugene spat out, his voice shaking slightly. Even as he focused on racing forward, Eugene didn't miss the changes that were occurring around them. The wind had begun to pick up and it felt different from an ordinary breeze. It wasn't just the wind either. The ground and the trees also felt different from the forest that these two had been walking through for the past 2 months or so. However, Eugene couldn't tell exactly what was different about it. He thus pulled WYD out of his cloak. "This is surprising." Tempest's voice rang out inside of Eugene's head. Without needing any explanation whatsoever, Tempest immediately grasped the situation. A primal spirit. No, could this be the spirit of the world tree? "What does that mean?" Eugene asked. "Do you know what a primal spirit is?" "Of course I know. It's the lowest class of spirit without a will of their own." Tempest let out a low chuckle at this answer. "The lowest class of spirit, you say? Fine, I guess you could also see it that way. Is that not the case? Primal spirits are the pure essence of spirits. Weaker than the lesser spirit of the wind, the sylph. A primal spirit can't even mount any resistance to the breeze that a sylph can raise. But primal spirits won't lose themselves even when they're caught in a sylph's breeze." Eugene listened silently. "Whether it is I, the Spirit King, or a sylph, a lesser spirit, we were all also primal spirits at one point." After pondering for a few moments, Eugene asked, "Is it a similar state to mana?" "That's right. Primal spirits are similar to mana. You might even see them as another aspect of mana. Just like how mana exists everywhere in existence, so too do the primal spirits. All wind, earth, fire, and water are composed of mana and the primal spirits." "But why did your reply sound so vague when you were saying that you were once a primal spirit?" Eugene pointed out. "Hamel, do you have any memories from when you were a fetus?" "I do have memories of the moment I was born. However, you don't remember the time when you were in your mother's womb. Even the fact that your memories start from the moment that you were born is because you were reincarnated with the memories and personality of your previous life. Ordinary people, no matter how good their memory might be, would not be able to remember the moment they were born. Well, of course that's the case. But what does all that have to do with the spirit of the world tree? Having signed a contract with Tempest, Eugene had thought that after coming to Samar he might perhaps be able to get Tempest to help him find the elves and their elven domain. Tempest was the spirit king of the wind, with command over the wind spirits, and as elves had an innate affinity to the spirits, their entire race was able to sign contracts with spirits without having to learn any particular spirit summoning techniques. However, things hadn't proved to be that easy. For a spirit, contracts were absolute. No matter how much authority that Tempest had as the spirit king of the wind, it was impossible for him to get the wind spirits under his command to spill any information about their contractors. Just as I was saying, Tempest's voice was filled with an unconcealable excitement. If a spirit that dwells in the wind is called a wind spirit, then the spirit that dwells in the world tree must be the spirit of the world tree. It is different from a tree spirit. Isn't the world tree basically just an old fairy tree? Are you being serious? Nah, I just wanted to try saying it. Even I know that the world tree is special. A tree whose young saplings were able to set up a barrier and block the advancement of the demonic disease couldn't be said to just be some ancient tree that had been around for a long time. In the first place, fairy trees were extremely rare and were used as powerful magical reagents. Elves have always placed their faith in the world tree. They believe that their deceased ancestors and those that they have lost, all of the elven souls are guided to the world tree after their death, and they also believe that the tree will always protect their race. But it's not like all elves believe that. After all, there are also elves who serve the god of light. Isn't that something unavoidable? Faith is a choice that everyone makes for themselves. In any case, the world tree is a spiritual and powerful existence that has received most of the faith from an entire race. The forest, no space itself, began to shake. The ground slowly began to move and the trees seemed to be drawing back. Even though I am the spirit king of the wind, I cannot control the winds in this place. I would not be the only one. No matter which spirit king it is, they would not be able to interfere with the spirits residing here. The leaf in Eugene's pocket was vibrating. As he pulled it out, he saw that it was emitting a bright ray of light. Then it began to float in the air all on its own. Eugene didn't keep hold of the leaf. Whomp. The space in front of them distorted and a path opened up. As the leaf flew into the passage, Eugene stretched his hand out to Christina. Christina hesitated for a moment and then took Eugene's hand. "Will it be dangerous?" Christina asked hesitantly. "There's no way," Eugene muttered as he pulled Christina closer to him. Then he kicked off the ground and leapt into the hole in space. After the two had passed through the opening, the hole closed up once more. The forest that had crawled apart to open up a path had returned to its original appearance. Shortly after that, boom, leaping over from some distant location, a man fell to the ground. After brushing off the dust from his landing, he turned to look at the surroundings. Even the trees that had crawled out of their way to open up a path had already returned to normal, and the soil they had overturned had also flattened back out. The path had closed. "I missed it," the man with a raised hood muttered as he sniffed the air. The scent was gone. Even though they had definitely disappeared in this location, no clues had been left behind as to their whereabouts, as if it had all been an illusion. "Damn it!" The man spat out a curse with a scowl twisting his lips. He had just wanted to peacefully follow them to their destination, but to think that things would really turn out like this. This was all because that little brat was way too sensitive. He had been just a bit too late because he had had to make sure to keep a good distance and follow them by their scent trail. The man thought to himself, could they still be somewhere nearby? There was no way to tell. Even though they should have been here just now, their scent trail had been erased from this location. Their scents seemed to be floating off into a completely different location. No, their scents were actually being scattered throughout the surrounding patch of forest. Was it because the trees had twisted aside to create a path, and this had created a gust of wind? "It's like a maze," the man observed as he sensed the myriad different scent trails. He decided to give up on chasing their scents. Well then, what should he do now? Should he just wait here thoughtlessly, when he had no idea when they might be coming back out? And it wasn't like there was any guarantee that they would be coming back out in the same place, was there? Since that was the case, then he might just end up waiting here for a long time, only to not achieve anything. The man was disgusted by the thought of such a possibility. In that case, wouldn't it be better for him to wait in a place that they were sure to return to? "Wow," Christina gasped. Was she really someone who knew how to make such an innocent sound? Eugene turned his head as he heard this clear exclamation coming from beside him. The look of awe on Christina's face was so pure that it could easily be called the most beautiful expression that he had ever seen on her. It was without any of her arrogance or pretentiousness. Christina was just sincerely admiring the sight in front of her. It couldn't be helped. Eugene placed the leaf of the world tree back into his pocket and looked ahead. He also felt the same admiration at the sight in front of him. It's like an umbrella, Eugene muttered in a low voice. It might sound like a poor metaphor, but this sight in front of them truly did look like an umbrella. The countless verdant branches and leaves of the huge tree before them, the world tree, looked like an umbrella that had covered up the sky. Rather than an umbrella, it feels more like a huge ceiling, Christina argued. Well, that might be true. But in the end they both cover things, right? Eugene replied as he looked up at the sky. No, he couldn't see the sky no matter how high up he looked. All that could be seen no matter where he turned were branches and leaves. They were currently at the top of a cliff and below them sprawled a city. A city that had been around for hundreds of years. Looking down at it like that, it almost seemed like an ancient ruin. No, if it's that old, it really is an ancient relic. As Eugene corrected himself, he glanced back behind them. He couldn't see the path that had connected them to this location. Tree roots, vines and soil were all intertwined with each other, blocking the path that had led them here. What should we do when we want to get back out? Christina asked in concern. Well, who knows, Eugene replied as he began walking forwards. For now we can tell this much. This place might be beautiful, but it's not a place where anything can survive. Yes, it does seem that way, Christina also agreed with a nod. Everything in this place seems to be connected to the world tree. However, that's all there is to it. Contrary to what we have seen, the mana here is almost non-existent. This was a weird problem. Boasting a magnificent stature, at first glance the world tree seemed full of mana, just like the area in the Lionheart Forest surrounding the ley line. However, there was almost no mana to be sensed. Even all of these green leaves on the outside, they might seem to be full of vitality, but for some reason it felt like they would crumble to dust if he tried to touch them. What is going on here? Eugene thought to himself. He was reminded of Vermouth's tomb, the space that had been filled with blooming artificial flowers. The trees and grass here weren't fake, but while they might be real, they were lifeless. Was all the mana concentrated into the barrier? What about the spirits? It's strange, Tempest muttered. The spirits are silent. They are there, but they aren't manifesting themselves. Eugene shrugged and leapt off the cliff, with Christina unfurling her wings of light and following after him. After the two had landed at the bottom of the cliff, they walked over to the city. The buildings were ancient, with roots growing from the ground and wrapping around the buildings. It doesn't seem like there's anyone here, Eugene murmured. Eugene had been expecting the elves to be here waiting for them. However, there were no elves to be found anywhere in the city. Although the place was beautiful, no one could actually have lived here. The mana was too faint and there was nothing for people to actually live off of. As they passed through the city, they saw a few dried-up trees. These trees were wrapped around and connected to the roots of the world tree, but they weren't fairy trees. Instead, there were several different types of fruit trees. Eugene got closer to one of the trees and placed his hand on it. It's dead. He could sense that the tree would collapse with just a slight press of his hand. It wasn't just the trees either. The soil had also dried up. None of the wells that were located throughout the city had any water in them. Eugene assessed the city. It'll be impossible for any of the wandering elves to relocate here. If the soil was revitalized and seeds were planted, would they be able to make this place livable? That's impossible. The land here is dead. That has been the case for quite some time. Without supplying a massive quantity of mana, it is impossible to revive this place. A massive quantity of mana. How much would that be exactly? Comparing it to the ley line in the Lionheart clan's estate, you would need several times the amount of mana there. What if we had a dragon heart? Could you really be thinking of stealing Sienna's staff? Asha was a magic staff that was made from a branch of the world tree and a dragon heart. If it's necessary, Eugene admitted. Even a dragon heart won't be enough. I sense that this might call for more than just mana. Hamel, I can feel an unknown discomfort coming from this whole space. What do you mean by that? This feeling, it reminds me of a demon king's sinister aura. Don't say something so ridiculous. This is the territory of the elves. That's the world tree right in front of us, Eugene responded aggressively as he strode forwards. Where could the elves have gone? Christina spoke up. Maybe they all decided to go into hibernation together, Eugene hypothesized. Or perhaps they just moved to a different place? Are you making fun of me? No, I'm being serious here. This isn't a place fit for someone to live in. There aren't any elves living here either. Do you really think that all the elves living here were killed? The city is in too good a state for that to be true. Although no one was here, the city wasn't actually in ruins. They crossed through the city and drew closer to the world tree. It had already seemed large when they were viewing it from a distance, but as they got closer they began to realize just how huge the world tree really was. The tree was at least as large as a mountain. And below there was a huge lake lying at the foot of the world tree. Even though all the water in the wells had dried up, the water in this lake had remained as it was. Eugene looked down calmly into the surface of the lake. Deep in the depths of the lake he could see the roots of the world tree. These roots had spread throughout the city, the land, and even this lake, connecting everything back to the world tree. Eugene crouched down and placed a hand on the surface of the lake. Really now, Eugene said with a sigh. The mana here wasn't as faint as everywhere else. All of the mana that would normally have been spread throughout the entire space was being concentrated into the world tree. Its roots had spread out like blood vessels, with the mana being the blood flowing back into the world tree. Eugene focused his concentration and tried to sense where exactly all the mana was flowing to. Then he found it. Eugene stood back up. Then, without saying a word, he stepped forward onto the lake. The surface of the lake supported Eugene's foot without even a ripple. Sir Eugene, Christina called to him. Eugene told her, wait here. His order might have been abrupt, but Christina didn't question him. She gave a slight nod and remained on the shore as Eugene walked across the large lake. Before too much time had passed, Eugene arrived right at the foot of the world tree. The exact location. Well, it didn't matter where he was exactly. Eugene took the leaf out of his pocket and brought it close to the world tree. The bark of the world tree cracked into two, opening up a path. Eugene tried to calm his nerves as he stepped into the tree. Eugene silently walked down the long passage that lay inside. This was the inside of the world tree. The mana outside was certainly scarce, but there was more mana inside the tree itself than any place that Eugene had ever been to. They're silent. Are you talking about the spirits? That's right. The primal spirits. No, the spirits of the world tree. They might not have formed an ego, but they are observing you. So what, do they feel welcoming? Something like that. Eugene smirked as he gazed around. He had finally found some elves. They were wrapped in tree vines with relaxed expressions on their faces, and they had been buried into the walls of this wide passage. It didn't seem like they were dead. They just looked like they had fallen into a deep sleep. He could hear their faint breathing and their heartbeats were resonating with each other. Thump, thump. The unified sound of their heartbeats made this passage feel like one giant cradle. Ah, Eugene gasped. After passing the elves who had fallen into a long nap, Eugene's steps came to a halt. I found you. What sort of expression should he be making? He couldn't figure it out on his own. Should he be smiling because he was happy? Or else, just like she had, should he be wallowing in tears instead? Sienna Meridian, Eugene called out her name. Like all the other elves, she had been placed into a deep sleep. Only, she had a huge hole through her chest. The thing keeping her alive was the world tree, whose vines wrapped around half her body. Eugene reached out with a shaking hand to touch Sienna. But in the end he couldn't do it. He was afraid that Sienna would shatter into pieces if he carelessly touched her. Like all the dead and fallen trees that he had seen on the way before arriving here. Her chest was pierced through. The vines of the world tree had woven together to fill the hole. With that, Sienna had been connected to the world tree. But she hasn't died. Sienna was breathing weakly and her heart was also beating. Eugene tried to smile. Hey, he said in a trembling voice. The results of his attempt weren't that great. Eugene weakly sat down on the floor as he stared at Sienna. Sienna, Eugene called out once more. There was no reply. In a shaking voice he asked, what happened to you? Then Eugene finally gave in, dropping his face into his hands as he wept. Chapter 105, Sienna Who. It was a good thing that he hadn't come here with Christina. This thought passed through Eugene's head. If she had come with him all the way here, he would have had to make excuses for why he had immediately burst into tears when he saw Sienna like this. but since they hadn't entered together there was no need for that. Eugene just silently allowed his tears to flow as he stared at Sienna covered in vines. He was overwhelmed by a mix of several emotions. First there was disbelief and sorrow, and then relief and anger. Sienna wasn't dead. Though she appeared to be in a state no different from being dead, having been inflicted with a wound so grave that it wouldn't be strange if she died at any moment, she was definitely still alive. Tempest was keeping his silence. He too was feeling a surge of mixed emotions regarding this situation. Sienna Meridian was, as far as Tempest knew, an exceptional arch-wizard, one of the most powerful in the world. 300 years ago, there had been no wizards who could outclass Sienna Meridian. Vermouth was also quite the amazing wizard in his own right, but in terms of their understanding of magic, Sienna was a few steps ahead of even Vermouth. That very Sienna was now being kept in a deep sleep, with a hole pierced through her chest. After letting his tears flow for a few more moments, Eugene scrubbed his eyes with the back of his hand. "Looks like I really have gotten old," Eugene spat out with his mouth twisted in a sneer. "I don't think I've ever shed as many tears as I have today." Or maybe it wasn't that he had gotten older but because he was still too young. At least that was what Eugene was hoping. After all, this body he had been reincarnated into was still just 19 years old. If not that, then it could also be that this situation itself allowed for nothing else but tears. Eugene snickered to himself as he shook his head. "Can you hear my voice?" Eugene asked, checking if Sienna showed any reaction. However, there was no response at all. Her closed eyes didn't flutter open, the corneas behind her eyelids didn't seem to move, and her lips didn't twitch either. Eugene didn't feel disappointed by this as he hadn't been expecting much in the first place. After taking a few deep breaths, he once more stretched a hand out toward Sienna. What if he broke something with a careless touch? Even as he felt this concern well up within him, he reached out to Sienna with as much care as if he were trying to touch a tender, young sprout. Eugene failed to make contact. The moment that he got close, a light went off between his outstretched hand and Sienna. He didn't lose his cool and merely pulled back his hand calmly. A green shell of light spread to cover both Sienna and the vines. Soon, Sienna and the vines connected to her were engulfed within a solid crystal. Eugene tapped on the surface of the crystal with his finger. The substance felt hard and it didn't seem like it would be broken easily. And even if it could be broken, he felt like he shouldn't try to do so. "It's a seal," Tempest muttered. Eugene nodded in agreement. "Should be." Placing his hand on the crystal, Eugene closed his eyes and focused, sensing the flow of mana within. The huge amount of mana concentrated into the world tree was being infused into Sienna's surroundings. With a wound that left her so close to death, is the world tree keeping her alive? What about the elves? Eugene still didn't have a clear grasp of the situation. 200 years ago, someone had intruded into Hamel's grave. Sienna had sensed the destruction of her familiar and had immediately headed to Hamel's tomb. There, Sienna had gotten into a fight with the mysterious intruder. Their conflict was fierce, leaving Hamel's grave in ruins. Everything except for the statue and the memorial stone had been destroyed. The intruder had then opened up his coffin and taken out his corpse. But why? He didn't know what reasons they had for doing something like that. In any case, they had taken his corpse out of his coffin and sealed the moonlight sword on top of the coffin. Meanwhile, Sienna had used the leaf of the world tree to teleport here after being seriously wounded. But what had happened after that? What had caused the city to be left empty? All the elves living here to be kept asleep and stored within the world tree, Sienna to be sealed, and the memories of how to enter the territory erased from the minds of the elves caught outside. "Couldn't you at least have left a letter for me?" Eugene grumbled as he turned to look around. Eugene was someone who could make a clear distinction between what he could and what he could not do. This seal wasn't something that he could prod carelessly. Sienna's wounds were serious enough that she had been left on the brink of death, and Eugene wasn't an expert on how to treat such wounds. Well, he really did not know what to do about the seal, but there was an expert on injuries and how to treat them waiting right outside. "Were you crying?" Under the usual circumstances, Christina would have teased Eugene as soon as she saw his puffy, red eyes. However, she got the feeling that she definitely shouldn't do something like that at this time. As such, Christina locked her lips shut and kept her silence. She ignored his red, bloodshot eyes and the tear tracks on his cheeks. Even though she could see all these obvious traces of grief, Christina didn't say anything about them, instead deciding to say something else. "It's like a cradle," Christina muttered as she walked past all the elves who were tied up in vines. It looks like people really do all think the same way. I got the same feeling as well when I saw all of this, Eugene replied with a grin. His voice sounded the same as usual. Together the two ventured deep into the world tree. Ah, Christina gasped as she saw the woman sleeping within the crystal. Even without Eugene telling her in advance, Christina instantly recognized the woman. It was Sienna Meridian. Christina calmed her shaking nerves and slowly walked over to the crystal. There was no need to ask why she had been brought here. Christina could see the hole going through Sienna's chest and the vines of the world tree that had extended into the wound. She could also hear the faint beating of Sienna's heart and her slow breath. Christina stood in front of the crystal and pulled out the wand hanging from her waist. A bright light surrounded her and her eyes lit up as she scanned Sienna. Her heart has been damaged, Christina reported while her eyes were examining the inside of Sienna's body. It's not just the heart either, most of her major organs have been contaminated. Contaminated? Eugene repeated. Yes, Christina confirmed. They might not be as damaged as her heart, but they probably won't be able to function properly. But she's still alive, Eugene insisted. Yes, Christina hesitantly agreed. The fact that Sienna was still alive was something of a miracle, but Christina didn't feel the need to say this out loud. She felt like it might not be appropriate to put it in such a way. It wouldn't be strange if she had died. No, she already has one foot in the grave. However, this magic is somehow preserving her life, said Christina. Can she still be saved? Eugene asked hopefully. These words were filled with such weight that Christina felt like she shouldn't answer him carelessly. After hesitating for a few moments, however, she took a deep breath and nodded. I'll do my best, she promised. Christina raised her wand in front of her and closed her eyes. Every time that the blue jewel embedded in the center of the cross sparkled, the halo of light surrounding her spread out further and further, as if resonating with the jewel. Eugene took a few steps backward. At the center of her halo of light, Christina licked her lips in concentration. A huge cross appeared below her feet and strange characters were scrawled around it, drawing a magic circle around Christina. The power of divine magic was determined by the strength of the caster's faith. The spell that Christina was casting right now was the highest level of revitalization magic, and even in the entirety of the Holy Empire, there were very few priests capable of casting it. The reason why the wealthy from other countries would donate astronomical sums of money to the Holy Empire every year was to ensure that this revitalization magic would be available for their use. Even if they were on their last breath, they could still be saved. It wasn't much of an exaggeration to say that this grade of revitalization magic wasn't just a spell, but a downright miracle. Even with all that, beads of sweat were running down Christina's forehead. Her brows had furrowed above her tightly closed eyes as she focused all of her concentration and drew heavily on her divine power. While it indeed wasn't an exaggeration to call this spell miraculous, in the end it still fell short of a true miracle. Although the light shining from Christina passed through the crystal and flowed into Sienna's body, Sienna's wound didn't show even the slightest sign of being healed. This was because it wasn't just the visible areas of the wound that needed to be healed. The light emanated by Christina wasn't able to purify all of the unknown contamination that was infecting Sienna's body. No, it wasn't that she couldn't, but rather that it wasn't necessarily a good idea to do it. Christina instinctively realized this fact. This contamination wasn't something that she should meddle with so carelessly. For the past hundreds of years, this contaminant had been seeping into Sienna's body, binding itself tightly to her mana, until it had reached its current state where it was as if it had become an integral part of her existence. Just what in the world is this? Christina thought in shock. This was her first time seeing such a contaminated body. Could this be some kind of curse? But this was the wise Sienna after all, so where in the world would anyone find a curse that could so thoroughly ravage the body of the greatest wizard in all of history? Christina withdrew her divine power. She pressed her lips tightly as she mustered all of her concentration. Her eyes were closed, but she could see everything around her clearly. In particular, she could sense that Sienna's body was rejecting the light of her divine power. The miracle-like revitalization spell simply scattered into sparks of light without having any effect. Watching from the side, Eugene's eyes darkened. Christina hated to see such a look on him. Even though she had so proudly declared herself a saint, she had no choice but to look helpless at the moment when a miracle truly was needed. Soon after they had first met, Eugene had mocked her by asking if turning crumbs into bread and water into wine really counted as miracles. He had argued that she should at least be able to do things like reattaching severed limbs. Now, if she really wasn't able to properly perform a miracle when they needed one, she was sure that he would continue to mock her from now on as well. Ching. Christina trembled. Was it really impossible? In his heart, Eugene had already resigned himself to this fact. If it really couldn't be done, then it couldn't be helped. Christina was casting the holy spell with all her might, even as sweat beaded on her brow, but Sienna's wounds aren't healing. But just when he was about to reach out to her and tell her that she could stop, Christina suddenly showed a strange reaction. You did your best, Eugene comforted her, reaching out to catch her when it looked like Christina was about to fall. Although divine power was based on one's faith, it wasn't an infinite source of power. Just like mana, if it was overused it would eventually run out. Bam! His outstretched hand was suddenly knocked away by a surge of light. Eugene's eyes widened as he looked at Christina. 1, 2, 3. 8 wings had manifested on Christina's back. The wings were made of light, and they were connected to a body of light that slowly left Christina's. While half of the figure was still embedded within Christina, it spread its 8 wings and looked up at the ceiling. It was an angel. Anise. Eugene unconsciously called out her name. It was the same angel that he had seen back at the Black Lion Castle, while they were falling off the cliff towards Vermouth's tomb. There could be no mistake about it. That hadn't been an illusion. The angel certainly resembled Christina, but she was definitely a different person, and her face was exactly the same as Eugene's recollection of Anise from 300 years ago. The angel lowered her head. With shining blue eyes she looked down at Christina, who was still connected to her, and then she looked at what was in front of her. There she saw Sienna, who was covered in vines and encased in the crystal. After staring at this sight for a few moments, the angel turned her head. The angel was now looking at Eugene. A smile appeared on her previously expressionless face. The way that her eyes and lips curled up, that thin smile, it was exactly the same as the smile that Eugene, no Hamel, had seen on Anise. Anise, Eugene called out once more in a shaking voice. Anise didn't reply. Her smile was indeed the same as it had been 300 years ago, but her shining eyes and wings gave her a mysterious aura, and with how her figure was wrapped in light, she looked more benevolent and divine than she had at any time in the past, back when she was still called the Saint. Her 8 widespread wings shone with light. The wand held in Christina's limp hands floated into the air, and the jewel in the center of the cross radiated bright blue light, as if it was resonating with the light of their combined divine power. Eugene couldn't understand what was currently happening, nor guess what was about to happen. He had never encountered something like this in his previous life, and it was impossible for him to even begin to comprehend this even with all the magical knowledge that he had learned after being reincarnated. However, as the light spun around like a storm, he saw it engulf everything in their surroundings and overlay them. A flash of light burst out, illuminating their surroundings. Suddenly, Eugene found himself watching a scene that he had never witnessed before. It was a view of the elven city. All of the elves who should have been living there had left the city and had gathered in front of the world tree. They all had desperate looks on their faces and seemed to be shouting something, but Eugene couldn't make out what exactly they were saying. They seemed to be overcome with a fear that had left them with no choice but to desperately flee their homes. The being that had driven them to gather here was floating high in the middle of the sky. It was a man wrapped up in a black cloak. His appearance was familiar to Eugene. He had long wavy hair, bright red eyes, and a twisted smile. When the 5 demon kings had first risen up as a threat to the world, the very first race that they had fought against was the dragons. Among the dragons, there was one who had betrayed his own race by splitting open the chest of the leader of the dragons. A dragon who had, for the first time in the history of dragonkind, committed the crime of murdering a member of their own race and had happily allowed the very depths of his being to be corrupted by demonic power. This was the black dragon Reincarnted. Floating in the sky, he looked down on the elves gathered below. The area of sky behind him seemed to be bizarrely distorted, looking as if it had broken and was about to fall. With his back to the sun, a cloud of darkness was spreading from Reincarnted. This expanding field of darkness transformed the sky of the elven domain from day into night. Reincarnated's lips moved as he appeared to be saying something. These words seemed to set the elves in an uproar. Eugene still wasn't able to hear anything that they were saying. However, he could clearly see the vicious twist in Raizakia's smile. The cloak covering Raizakia's body fluttered as he abandoned his human form. In a burst of black light, a huge dragon spread his wings to cover the lofty heavens. His scales were discolored from corruption, and his huge red eyes looked like they were filled with blood. As Raizakia spread his jaws wide, a dark ray of light gathered between his sharp fangs. This was his dragon's breath. Something like that wasn't complicated enough to be called a spell. Any dragon could use the breath by sheer natural instinct. However, Raizakia's breath couldn't be compared to any ordinary dragon's breath. Though the world did not recognize him as a demon king, according to Eugene's memories, Raizakia was already a monster comparable to the demon kings. Raizakia released his breath. There was no way that the elves gathered here would be able to withstand the attack. In other words, everyone standing below was about to perish. Facing this descending breath, the elves sensed their impending doom. Everyone seemed to be prepared for the inevitable. But the moment that the dark breath was released, someone walked out from behind the elves. It was Sienna. Fortunately, blood wasn't flowing from the open wound in her chest, but her face was deathly pale, and she looked as if a corpse had been forced into motion. When Raizakia had let out his breath, Sienna had been standing behind the elves. When the breath burst forth in an explosion of light, Sienna was already standing in front of them. Sienna stretched out her hand, and the breath released by Raizakia was prevented from advancing any further. Raizakia's huge eyes lit up with astonishment. Having blocked the breath, black blood was now dripping out from Sienna's lips. The elves screamed as they tried to support Sienna, but black blood was also flowing from their own eyes, noses and lips. The roots of the world tree suddenly reached out and wrapped around Sienna and the elves. Wrapped in these roots, Sienna tightly clenched her outstretched hand. The entire space around Raizakia appeared to twist, and the darkness brought about by Raizakia was dissipated. In response to this, Raizakia hurriedly spread his wings as he frantically tried to twist his body out of the way. Hundreds of magic circles suddenly appeared around him as he tried to cast a spell. He seemed to be shouting something. No, he was screaming. Then all the magic circles that he had summoned slowly faded away and disappeared. With black blood still dripping from her mouth, Sienna stared at Raizakia. Something seemed to amuse her as she shrugged with a smile and then lightly waved her outstretched fist at him. Then she extended a solitary middle finger. The moment that Sienna flipped him off, Raizakia's gigantic body was sucked into a hole in the distorted space. Eugene watched all of this happen in awe. Sienna stumbled and fell. The elves tried to catch Sienna, but they were also unable to walk more than a few steps. One by one they all fell down. Knock knock. Eugene's shoulders trembled as he was startled by the sudden voice. Until just a moment ago he had been watching a scene that had taken place hundreds of years ago. But what was going on now? Knock knock. Was this an illusion? A dream? Or was the holy sword playing tricks on him? Could it be the angel? Anise? His mind was in turmoil. Eugene let out a groan as he clutched his aching head. Knock knock. What in the world was going on? Raizakia had disappeared. What exactly had happened to him? Why had the dragon been standing in the sky of the elven domain in the first place? What about Sienna? And the elves? What happened to them after all that? Knock knock. Then there was the sight that had now appeared in front of him. Aren't you going to answer me already? Eugene couldn't find any words. Stupid idiot asshole. At the foot of the gigantic tree. On top of that, you've even turned out to be a crybaby. Her light purple hair fluttering in the breeze. I never thought that you would be able to cry so much. Eugene opened his mouth soundlessly. See what I mean? Sienna was sitting there with a smile. You're crying again, Hamel. Chapter 106, Sienna 3. Was this also a dream? Eugene just stared at Sienna with a blank gaze. Her figure brought up so many memories. This was the Sienna that Eugene, no Hamel remembered from 300 years ago. She looked like the portrait left in her mansion in Aroth, like the statue in Meridian Square, and like the Sienna he had seen in the scene from the past that the Holy Sword had shown him. They were all she, Sienna Meridian. From her waves of purple hair to her big green eyes, everything was just like the Sienna that Hamel remembered. Just how long are you going to keep crying? Sienna asked with a snicker as she got up from her seat on the ground. I never knew that you could be such a crybaby, Hamel. I never once got the chance to see you cry in the past. Eugene was still speechless. Well, 300 years have passed since then. But no, it wasn't really 300 years for you, was it? You probably weren't even able to feel all that time passing. Though I don't know what it was like since I've never been reincarnated myself. Well, that's not really all that important. I'm actually pretty happy to be able to see this new side of you, Sienna confessed with a smile and a shrug. Anyways, are you just going to keep crying like that? Back when you flipped me off, you weren't crying like you are now. What is with you? Eugene spat out as he purposefully twisted his face into a scowl. Why were these damn tears flowing out of their own accord? These stupid fucking tear ducts. He had no intention of crying, but why did they just keep leaking tears? Covering up his embarrassment, Eugene cursed. Fuck, just what the hell is going on with you? What did you think you were doing? Just what kind of plot am I in now? What am I doing here, and what are you doing here, and just what the hell happened to you? No, what the hell happened to everyone? His words weren't coming out properly. The inside of his head and his emotions were all messed up. Even so, Eugene marched on over toward Sienna. Just what in the world is going on with Anise? Eugene demanded. How the fuck did Anise become an angel, and what's with her having 8 wings? And Molen? What about Molen? What is that bastard up to? Sienna sighed. Hamel. And Vermouth. That bastard. Just what is he up to? What exactly happened in my grave? Then there's me. Eugene paused for breath. Why was I reincarnated and then left in the dark? You fuckers. Why couldn't at least one of you give me a proper explanation? Hamel, Sienna repeated. Eugene didn't react even as he heard his name being called. His tears had stopped, but his heart felt so frustrated that he somehow felt that it might be better for him to just bow his head and burst into wailing instead. His heightened emotions still hadn't fully subsided and the inside of his head was still spinning. Panting for breath, Eugene looked closely at the figure in front of him. Sienna was right in front of his nose. However, he couldn't feel any sense of presence coming from her. She was clearly standing right in front of him, but it somehow felt like she didn't exist. Just like when he had seen her in Arath. The Sienna in front of him felt like nothing more than a phantom. Just what the hell is going on? Eugene squeezed out this question once more in a hoarse voice. He reached out to Sienna with a trembling hand. He wasn't sure whether he would be able to touch her. After all, he hadn't been able to in Arath. At that time he hadn't been able to say anything to Sienna. All he could do was flip her off in order to get her to recognize him. The truth was that instead of flipping her off, he had wanted to do something else. He had wanted to grab Sienna, who was wandering around like a ghost, by the shoulders, hold her in front of him and then pull her into a hug. If he had been able to do that, Sienna, this annoying and savage chick, would surely have kicked him in the shin and said, "Are you crazy?" No, when he took into account Sienna's sassy personality, instead of kicking him in the shin, she would have probably boxed his ears. He would have been fine with anything. No matter what, he had just wanted to touch Sienna. But he hadn't been able to do so in Arath. Sienna hadn't been able to hear him no matter how many times he called her, and when he had tried to reach out to grab her, he hadn't even been able to touch her. But now, Hamel. He could touch her. His outstretched fingertips made contact with Sienna's cheek. He couldn't feel even the slightest warmth coming from her. However, Eugene could nevertheless feel the soft texture of her skin. From this skin, without any trace of warmth, he could still sense Sienna's existence. "I'm here," Sienna said with a faint smile. Her smile resembled the benevolent smile that he had seen in her portrait. A smile that hadn't really suited Sienna. However, this was unmistakably Sienna's smile. Fuck. Eugene's head dropped as he spat out the curse. That kind of smile really doesn't suit you. You son of a bitch. His insult was immediately returned with one of her own. Sienna grabbed a tuft of Eugene's hair and yanked on it, but Eugene couldn't feel any power coming from her grip. "That goes for you as well, Hamel. What the hell is with this mug of yours? If you hadn't flipped me off in order to show me who you were, I would never have been able to recognize you as Hamel even if I had all the time in the world. I didn't know I was going to be born like this, nor did I have any say in it," Eugene complained. "Humph. Even though you say that, you must be pretty satisfied with your current looks, right?" Sienna accused. "Hamel, ever since the old days, you've always been secretly concerned about that kind of thing. When have I ever?" Eugene attempted to deny it. Look at you pretending not to know what I'm talking about. Don't you remember what you were like when the five of us first started partying together? Sienna recalled, you said that this was your first time being a member of a party, so you bought some fancy clothes that made you look like an asshole and even had your hair cut. Why are you bringing up something that happened so long ago? Eugene muttered in embarrassment. Well, no matter how much you decorated your previous life's face, it still looked rough and ferocious, but now, well, it's fine I guess. Even if you go around looking like a beggar, you'll still look a lot better than you did in your previous life. After saying this, Sienna raised both hands. She reached out and grabbed Eugene's cheeks. While rubbing Eugene's cheeks, she snickered to herself. Although it's not the face that I remember, you really are Hamel. That fact is unmistakable. Hamel, Sienna's voice faltered. You finally returned. You have truly come back to me. Eugene was silent. This really is a strange feeling. Your face as well as your body might be different, but since I know that you're Hamel, it just feels like I'm meeting a different form of Hamel. Sienna's fingers moved back and forth across the middle of Eugene's face. He had been wondering what she was doing, but Eugene suddenly realized that Sienna was drawing imaginary scars on his unmarked face. In his previous life, Hamel's face had been covered in these scars. Eugene let out a snort and pulled his head backward. What's with the rude behavior? Eugene demanded. Sienna pouted. What do you mean? How am I being rude? Of course you're being rude. Why are you trying to draw scars on my clean face? Well, by drawing these scars, I just want to see how different your face is from your previous one. Still pouting, Sienna poked Eugene in the cheek with her finger. Your cheeks are softer than they were in your previous life, Sienna observed. Eugene defended himself. That's just because I haven't lost all of my baby fat yet. Baby fat, baby fat? Sienna repeated in disbelief before bursting into laughter. Ah, how cute, Hamel. Just how old is your new body? You definitely look like you're still pretty young. Ignoring her amusement, Eugene answered, 19 years old. Well, really? Are you really? You're still just 19 years old? Back when we first met, Hamel, you were 22, weren't you? At that time you definitely looked a few years older than your actual age. Eugene also recalled that moment. During that time he had made quite a name for himself as a mercenary. While he was waiting at a port trying to find a way to get into Helmuth, Vermouth and his party had come to visit Hamel. Isn't he just some scumbag mercenary that you can find just about anywhere? So what reason could you have for needing to take this one in particular with us? Sienna had looked down on Hamel while clicking her tongue at him in disapproval. She had already become well known as an archwizard, so she didn't show much interest in Hamel, who was just a lowly mercenary. The same went for Hamel as well. Why should he pay any attention to someone who so rudely complained about him during their very first meeting? Both of their first impressions of each other weren't at all pleasant. Vermouth had practically dragged Hamel into becoming a member of the party. After that, Sienna had continued to ignore Hamel for quite a while, and Hamel had also avoided Sienna. Anise had instead been the one to take care of Hamel while constantly nagging him, and as for Molin, well, he had treated Hamel with warmth from the very beginning. I remember, Eugene acknowledged. Giggling, Sienna withdrew the hands that had been rubbing his cheeks and said, we all got on a ship together and left the port. It was a large merchant ship, but the sea route leading to Helmuth was full of monsters and demonic beasts, and sometimes even crazed black wizards riding on ghost ships crewed by the undead would appear. Eugene hummed as he too was caught in their shared memories. At that time we were all so young and, Sienna hesitated, immature. Although Vermouth was already a monster at that point. You, me, Anise and Molin, none of us were as polished as Vermouth. I was too overconfident in my skills, so I acted as I pleased, but then... You almost died, Eugene finished her thought. He remembered that moment. It was during an attack by an undead fleet of ghost ships. While Vermouth and Anise were dealing with the undead, Molin, Hamel and Sienna were taking care of the monsters and demonic beasts that were leaping out of the sea. Sienna, who had been lost in her own sense of self-importance, had been flying through the sky and unleashing a storm of spells. She was being far too careless by doing so. The black wizards who had been hiding at the bottom of the sea had intercepted Sienna, and their sudden attack managed to disrupt Sienna's mana. It was Hamel who had rescued Sienna from falling into the swirling seas below. From that moment on, Sienna had stopped ignoring Hamel. Thanks. As blood was dripping from both her nostrils, Sienna had thanked him. It's fine, just plug up your nosebleed. Hey. Also, don't act so full of yourself. Just because you know how to fly in the sky for a bit, you were darting about here and there acting like you could do everything all on your own. In these types of battlefields where there are a lot of foes, the ones who stand out are usually the first to fall. Got it? Although I am grateful for your help, you really are kind of a bastard. Sienna, Eugene said as he shook himself free of the memory playing itself out inside of his head. After all, Sienna was right in front of him. Just what exactly happened? Eugene asked firmly as he stared into Sienna's eyes. This was what he had been trying to ask her from the very start. I'm asking you to tell me what happened at the castle of the Demon King of Incarceration? What kind of promise did Vermouth make? Sienna hesitated. Say something, Eugene demanded. Hamel, Sienna said with a weak smile, placing her hands on Eugene's shoulders. Do you believe in miracles? Why are you bringing that up all of a sudden? The fact that you're here right now, that you've met me here and are talking to me. All of these are miracles. Crackle. The space they were in shook. Startled, Eugene quickly stepped backwards. The huge world tree suddenly overlapped the small tree that had been standing behind Sienna. For a moment, her appearance in reality also overlapped with the sight of Sienna smiling weakly. Are you dead? Eugene asked gravely. Nope, Sienna denied this with a smile and a shake of her head. Crackle. But behind her smiling face, Eugene was still able to see through to what she looked like in reality. Her pale, bloodless face with her eyes closed peacefully. The hole in her chest and the vines entangled around and within her. Hamel, Sienna spoke up. Don't blame Vermouth for this. What? Eugene asked. Vermouth, he has more burdens to carry than we do, know more than anyone in the world. If he hadn't had made such a promise with that bastard. Was Vermouth the one that left you in this state? Hamel. I asked you if it was Vermouth? I'm not an idiot either. Sienna, I've been to my grave. What I saw there. I already know that. Because I left the leaf of the world tree in a place where only someone with your soul could enter. Sienna interrupted him as she stared up at Eugene with a wry smile. What happened? There was just a misunderstanding between us. What? Eugene asked in disbelief. That necklace. You're still wearing it, Sienna remarked as she pointed at Eugene's chest with a mischievous smile. It really has been through a lot. Hamel, did you know? Your body and soul were originally doomed to either be annihilated or become the playthings of the Demon King of Incarceration. However, they were returned. Eugene silently processed this. I don't know the full extent of the oath that Vermouth made at that time. However, thanks to the promise that he swore, all of us who were there, me, Anise, and Mullen, were spared. And the terms also included the return of your body and soul, Sienna revealed. Eugene had thought that might be the case. He was killed by the spell of none other than Belial, the one who was known as Incarceration's staff. If he was lucky, his soul would have just dissipated into nothing. The absolute worst outcome would be that Belial had successfully offered Hamel's soul to his master, the Demon King of Incarceration. However, Hamel's soul hadn't just disappeared. His body also hadn't disintegrated, and the remaining corpse had been interred within the coffin in Hamel's grave. Sienna finally revealed something. I placed your soul within that necklace. Sienna. That necklace. The coffin. I'll take it with me. That goes against the agreement. Haven't we all already agreed on this? Eugene recalled the scene from the past that the Holy Sword had shown him. Sienna continued, what exactly happens when someone dies? Anise said that they go to heaven, but I can't place my faith in the gods like Anise could. I'm a wizard, Hamel. I can't trust in anything that I can't see for myself and I don't comprehend. No, in the end, that's all just an excuse. With a snicker of self-derision, Sienna sat down on the spot. I just didn't want to let you go ahead of me, Hamel. So it just worked out that way. Were you satisfied with your death? If you really were, then you're a son of a bitch. What gives you the right to go and get yourself killed out of self-satisfaction? Neither I, Anise, Mullen, nor Vermouth, none of us wanted you to die. We couldn't just accept your death, and we didn't want to let your soul go to its final resting place ahead of us. Everyone had agreed on this plan. That's why I captured your soul, so that you wouldn't leave without us. So that someday, somehow, we would be able to meet again. In the world that everyone wanted to see. After we had managed to kill all the demon kings at that time we would send you off, Sienna finished tearfully. Sienna was just like how Eugene remembered her. She had always been stubborn and determined to get her own way. Even if it went against common sense, she would always prioritize the option that only she herself could understand and accept. In the face of this stubbornness, reasoning didn't matter. Wizards had always been a bunch of mentally unsound people in the first place, and Sienna was no exception. What about Vermouth? Eugene asked. Sienna lifted her head to look up at Eugene and said, it seemed that his plans were slightly different from ours. I don't know why Vermouth did it or what he was really planning. It's not like I'm Vermouth, and right up until the end, I never really understood him. Sienna, Eugene prompted. I always kept the necklace that held your soul with me. But in your grave he took it from me. These words made Eugene's hair stand on end. That bastard didn't even say anything to me. At your grave he killed my familiar in order to get it to call me there. Then as soon as I arrived according to his plan, he attacked me, Sienna muttered as she rubbed her chest. But was that truly Vermouth? The truth is that I can't really be sure of it. Vermouth, I thought that he had already died. He should have been dead. However, he showed up looking perfectly fine, didn't even say anything, attacked me, disappeared after stealing the necklace from me, and then... Sienna, Eugene tried to comfort her. Sienna shook her head and continued, but Hamel, you shouldn't blame Vermouth. Eugene gritted his teeth at these words. He just couldn't understand her. She was asking him not to blame Vermouth? Don't spout such nonsense, he gritted out. The fact that you're here, that means Vermouth must have returned your soul to life, Sienna pointed out. That son of a bitch, he didn't even leave any kind of explanation, Eugene complained. He even tried to kill you. That goes for me as well, Sienna said with a smile as she held up her fist and looked at it. Just like how that bastard was trying to kill me, I also tried to kill that bastard. Hamel, I'm sure that you're feeling betrayed right now, but I also felt just as betrayed back then. As much as you do know, perhaps even more than you. Eugene held his silence for a moment. That's why I just can't believe it. Was the one who called me there and tried to kill me really Vermouth? Could the one that I fought there and tried so hard to kill truly be Vermouth? Sienna asked herself. Eugene shouted, there's no way it couldn't be. It's not like you were there, asshole, Sienna cut him off, flipping up the middle finger of her raised fist. Eugene unconsciously smiled at this sight. I'm the one who almost died, so why are you shouting and acting angrier than I am? I'm the one who personally fought with him there and had a hole pierced right through my chest. I'm the one who got instantly destroyed and was forced to leave the soul with your necklace behind. So why the hell are you making such a fuss while I'm trying to speak? Sienna yelled at him. Ha, Eugene half snorted. Sienna continued her tirade. You should know how to listen when someone else is trying to speak. Why is your personality still so shitty after somehow dying and returning back to life? If you died after having refused to listen to what others were telling you like an asshole, then shouldn't you have at least learned how to quietly listen to other people? You're right, Sienna, Eugene easily conceded. Because we've finally met after so long and I've gotten a bit older than you since you died, I was trying to hold back and be a bit more gentle, but you... Whether it's in the past life or the present, you really are a fucking stupid bastard. Sienna spat out this curse as she leapt to her feet. Then she quickly marched over and grabbed Eugene by the collar. Hey, Hamel, listen closely. Although the person who tried to kill me did look like Vermouth, I don't think it really was Vermouth. Do you understand? Do you really think that what you're currently saying makes any sense? Eugene asked skeptically. Ah, really? If I say that it didn't seem like him, then you should just believe it wasn't him until proven otherwise. In any case, I don't really know what was in the promise that he made. Vermouth should be behind your reincarnation, so, well, I think it worked out for the best. I thought that we would only be able to reunite with you in heaven, but it seems that we're able to reunite while we're both still alive. Even as she said this, Sienna started shaking Eugene by his collar. Anyway, what's your name? Hamel, Eugene answered simply. Not that one. The name you got after reincarnating, Sienna insisted. Eugene, he said reluctantly. Sienna hesitated. The color of your hair and eyes, and your mana. There's an idea that keeps popping up inside my head, but I'm kinda afraid to confirm whether it's true or not. Whatever you're thinking, it's probably correct, Eugene finally admitted. Really? Were you really reincarnated as Vermouth's descendant? Yeah. So that means your name is Eugene Lionheart, I guess? Yeah. Could Vermouth have developed dementia? Sienna muttered to herself as she finally released Eugene's collar. Why would he reincarnate you as his own descendant? Indeed, when that bastard took more than 10 wives and started having a lot of children, I had hoped that he was just trying to make up for all the suffering that we went through in Helmuth by living well. But could he have purposefully been increasing the number of his descendants to prepare for your reincarnation? We can't be sure of that, but it really did feel like a gut punch to be reincarnated as Vermouth's descendant, Eugene confessed. It might feel kind of fucky, but I think that there are more positives than negatives, Sienna assessed. In the first place, your looks are a lot better than they were in your previous life, and your body should also be much better than the one you had as Hamel, right? That might be the case, Eugene acknowledged reluctantly. You still have your memories, and a body that is overwhelmingly superior to the one that you had in your previous life. Did he plan for you to kill the remaining demon kings? Sienna hypothesized. If that was what he wanted, then he could have just reincarnated himself, Eugenie protested. No, even without reincarnating. Could it be that you're really Molin and not Hamel? Sienna spat out as she stared at Eugene. Even in such a situation, Eugene couldn't help but scowl fiercely at these words. Apologize. I'm sorry. My words were a bit harsh. Be careful with your words, Eugene warned her gruffly. Seeing how rude you are, you're definitely Hamel. That's unmistakable. In any case, there has to be a good reason why Vermouth didn't reincarnate himself or try to kill the demon kings with his own hands. As she said this, Sienna took a few steps back and stroked her chin as she looked at him thoughtfully. Also, I think you're just the right person for the job. Eugene blinked. What? I'm talking about you. Even with the body of an insect, you were already that strong. Now that you've been reincarnated with the memories of your past life, and in a body that's overwhelmingly superior to the one you had before, then it's like I just said. I think that you can become even stronger than Vermouth, Sienna stated confidently. Eugene scoffed. Don't say something so ridiculous. You're the one who shouldn't say anything ridiculous, asshole, Sienna retorted angrily. Although I understand how you feel, considering that you were always beaten by Vermouth as you sparred with him every day, if you really think about it, that just means that you were the one who was closest to Vermouth's strength among all of us. Vermouth was certainly special, but you were just as special as he was. Vermouth may have eventually failed, but Hamel, if it's you, then you might really be able to do it. Eugene's lips twitched slightly as he heard these words. Sienna didn't miss this reaction. She snickered and slapped Eugene on the shoulder. Look at that smile. Are you really that happy I complimented you? Ahem, Eugene coughed in embarrassment. In any case, getting back to what I was saying. Hamel, don't be too angry at Vermouth. Because I don't really blame him either. Isn't that just because you don't want to accept reality? Shut up. I'm a wizard. Even if I do see something with my own eyes, if I can't truly understand and accept it, then I won't believe in it. It feels like those words have changed a bit from before. Frankly speaking, Hamel, just what do you have to blame Vermouth for? He's the one who brought you back to life. In a much better body than the one you had in your previous life at that. You're angry that he didn't give you an explanation? So what if he didn't? You should just be grateful that you got to live once again after dying. What do you have to blame Vermouth for? Sienna rattled out these questions and then pointed at her own chest. I'm telling you that even I don't blame him for piercing a hole in my chest. Got it? I believe in Vermouth. So you should also have faith in him. We both owe Vermouth. I don't know what the fuck you're talking about, Eugene grumbled. Even though you've come back from the dead, you really are just as childish as you always were, Sienna said with a smile. Changing the subject, Eugene asked, so what happened to Anise and Molin? I don't know. How exactly did Anise become an angel? You're not the only one who's surprised by that, so don't ask me. As for Molin, after that idiot founded his kingdom, Sienna's eyes suddenly widened in surprise. Did you already know? Molin, that idiot, he actually became a real king? Do you really think I wouldn't have heard about that? Who would have thought that Molin would actually become a real king? You should have been there to see the founding ceremony of the Ruhr kingdom. Have you heard how Molin, that fool, only came to the after-party wearing a cloak and a pair of panties? Just why? I gave him the panties as a present and told him that they would appear as a formal dress that was only visible to those who were virtuous and brave. But that bastard really did come out wearing only that pair of panties. His vassals were horrified, but he told them that they couldn't see his clothes because they weren't virtuous and brave enough. Sienna was unable to finish speaking as she burst into laughter and was forced to clutch her stomach. Once she had calmed down, she continued, In any case, I need to thank Anise. Eugene kept his silence. The fact that I'm currently able to speak to you like this, it's all thanks to Anise for making this miracle happen, Sienna said gratefully. Before I came here, I saw a vision of the past, Eugene mentioned. Ah, you saw Raizakia. Sienna's face twisted into a scowl as she spat out the dragon's name. In hindsight, the responsibility for why I'm in this state lies more with that son of a viper than it does with Vermouth. He actually figured out how to come and find me while I was on the verge of death. Then he even broke through the barrier and invaded the elven domain. So what exactly happened? Eugene asked. Didn't you see it? That guy shot his breath at us and I blocked it. Since I wasn't in a good condition, I wasn't able to block it completely. You remember what Raizakia's breath is like, don't you? It's basically a clump of demonic power. No, Raizakia himself is a huge clump of demonic power. He's like a sewer rat that's infested with germs, Sienna said as her body shuddered in disgust and she clenched her fists. The elves there were all infected by him. I also couldn't stop his demonic power from leaking into my wounds. That's how I got contaminated with his curse. Just before I was about to die, I managed to make a connection to the world tree. Then I sealed my body and all the elves with me inside of the world tree. Sienna sat back down on the ground with her shoulders slumped. After she had composed herself, she continued, although I feel sorry for the elves who were caught outside, at that time there weren't any other options. Because I was in a desperate situation where I had to hurry to keep myself and hundreds of elves from dying. I sealed away the entire territory and altered the memories of the elves so that no one would be able to re-enter it. I was able to do that thanks to the ancient magic that has been passed down through the world tree. This tree is actually connected to every elf's soul. And so? What do you mean, and so? You also saw it, didn't you? The elves and I have been sealed inside of the world tree. Not that. I mean, how do I get you to open your eyes again? Eugene asked as he sat down facing Sienna. For a few moments, Sienna didn't continue to speak, and just stared at Eugene, who was sitting so close to her. Hamel, I made 2 mistakes, Sienna eventually confessed after letting out a short huff and folding her arms. The first is that I tried to kill Raizakia, but I failed. If I had been able to kill him, then I would have been able to cleanse his curse from my wounds. And the other one? Eugene prompted. Since it was too difficult to chase him out, I banished him to the outer dimension. Sienna's brow furrowed as she said this. Or well, I tried to. If I had managed to banish him properly, then this curse wouldn't have lasted for so long. Seeing as it's still clinging on without getting any worse, it looks like he was probably caught in some kind of dimensional rift. That guy is pretty amazing. Doesn't that mean he's still holding on after getting stuck in a dimensional rift for over 100 years? In that case, Eugene said with a grin. If we kill Raizakia, who's been stuck in a dimensional rift, you'll also get better? Probably, Sienna confirmed hesitantly. How do we find him? Eugene eagerly asked. It's impossible for you right now, Sienna denied his request. I know, Eugene admitted. But tell me anyway. Because I'll go after him and kill him as soon as it does become possible. Without saying anything immediately, Sienna just looked at Hamel before sighing. You really are Hamel. What are you saying all of a sudden? Eugene demanded. No, it's nothing, Sienna said with a soft laugh.